Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, Israel and the United Arab Emirates come to a landmark normalization agreement. We take a look at how the Arab world illustrates the idea of peace with Israel, and the Israeli Air Force heads abroad for its first operational deployment ever in Germany. Beginning tonight in the south, the IDF is closing off the Gaza fishing zone and attacking Hamas terror group positions across the Strip in response to another round of Hamas rocket attacks targeting Israeli civilian communities. One of the latest rockets causing severe damages to a residential home and wounding an Israeli man. Hamas, for their part, are saying that their latest rocket launches come in response to the IDF targeting so-called protesters on the border fence. Israel, however, is confirming clashes along the fence, reporting that targeted Palestinians were burning tires, hurling explosives and grenades towards the fence, attempting to infiltrate into Israel, or were carrying out explosive and incendiary kite or balloon attacks, causing upwards of 20 fires in Israel just on Saturday alone. Another 10 sparked today. Meanwhile, the Kerem Shalom goods crossing with Gaza has also been closed in response to a whole week of rockets and incendiary balloons. Now, the top news across the Middle East, though, a truly historic moment with massive ripple effects in just about every way imaginable. Israel and the United Arab Emirates are officially and openly normalizing ties.
Well, today we usher in a new era of peace between Israel and the Arab world. I just came from an historic virtual conference between myself, President Donald Trump, and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates. We announced the establishment of a full and formal peace between Israel and the UAE. It includes the mutual opening of embassies, direct flights, and many, many other bilateral agreements. This is the greatest advancements toward peace between Israel and the Arab world in the last 26 years, and it marks the third formal peace between Israel and an Arab nation.
Joining the ranks of his predecessors, Prime Ministers Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Thursday became the third Israeli leader to announce an official peace agreement with the Arab world, after Egypt and Jordan. Then thanking United States President Trump's administration for facilitating this agreement, Netanyahu concluded at the podium with high hopes that other Arab states will be soon to follow.
In recent years, Israel, under my leadership, has made advancement with ties with such countries as Sudan, Oman, Bahrain, and other nations in the Gulf. I have reason to be very optimistic that today's announcement with the UAE will be followed by more Arab nations joining our region's circle of peace.
To that end, Israeli officials reportedly already in talks with Arab states, Morocco supposedly being the most likely to normalize next. In fact, to many in the Arab world, this is hardly surprising.
والله الاتفاقية دي موجودة من زمان أصلا بس ما كانش معلن عنها ومعظم الدول العربية عاملة الاتفاقية دي مع إسرائيل من زمان يعني مش من دلوقتي بس هو مجرد إن هو أعلنوا عنها دلوقتي فده لا هيقدم ولا هيأخر هو كده الكلام موجود من الأول.
Israelis, for their part, plastering the United Arab Emirates flag across the Tel Aviv municipality, are mostly excited about the news too.
So I think the agreement with the United Arab Emirates is very exciting. As an Israeli, we want peace with all of our neighbors, and so peace with them is, one very big step in that direction. And so it's very exciting, and this is a great moment for all of Israel.
Meanwhile, Emirati locals, Jews and Muslims, are hailing the peace as well, sharing welcoming messages online, and even offering hotel discounts to Israelis of up to 40%. Locals calling it a cheaper destination for Israelis than the Israeli city of Eilat. The normalization paves the way for Israelis and Emiratis to openly share in investments and cooperate in fields like dealing with the coronavirus, water technology, agrotech, tourism, and defense, specifically against Iranian expansionism in the Middle East. Nothing without its drawbacks, though. The deal is angering many right-wingers in Israel over the stipulation that Jerusalem must give up on annexation plans in the West Bank, at least for the time being. UAE officials, however, are saying that it was the only way forwards.
So we were thinking, let us try and put one and one together. Let us try and develop this organic relationship that is developing with Israel in many, many areas. and let's really try and get something tangible. Let us try and basically deal with the current threat towards a two-state solution, negotiations for a two-state solution. And the current threat is really this annexation of Palestinian territories. So this is how the idea began. And the idea was very clear that Israel will commit in a three-way phone call with the United States to stopping annexation, suspending it, and at the same time, we will be able to also announce that we will begin what I would call a normal relationship with Israel in various areas: technology, investment, healthcare, agriculture, etc., leading to reciprocal diplomatic representation.
Now, of course, in the wake of the new agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, there are still many questions unanswered. IDF intelligence and strategic researcher and head of Palestinian Studies Forum at the Moshe Dayan Center of Tel Aviv University, Colonel Michael Milstein, is here to discuss. Colonel, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Now, all right, so first of all, what is the deal? Because we're hearing a lot of differing reports. Is this a normalization deal or a peace deal?
Actually, it's a normalization deal because a peace deal, it's between two states who has a conflict, ongoing conflict between them, and we in the UAE don't have any conflict, so it's a normalization. Actually, a formal announcement about hidden relations between the two states for about 2 decades.
All right, but formally speaking, there's not really much of a difference then.
That's right. Except
functionally speaking, I should say.
Yes, except the flights, the direct flights between Tel Aviv and Abu Dhabi and the UAE. This will be much more easier than the past.
All right, now you said 2 decades. How long is
about
Israel?
More than 2 decades.
So yeah, how long has Israel and the UAE been dealing with each other, and to what degree?
Actually, the beginning of these hidden relations began after 1993, after Oslo Agreement. It was a very gradual development, very cautious and sometimes very clandestine, focused on the military and the diplomatic layers. But during the last decade, it also developed to other aspects, such as the technological, the economical aspect, and now it's fully formal relations between the two states.
All right, so who are the winners and the so-called losers in this deal in the Middle East?
Absolutely, we can say that the winners are all the what we define, or we call the moderate Sunni camp: Saudi Arabia, Egypt, maybe Jordan, and of course all the Gulf states. The most prominent player who we can define as a loser are the Palestinians, because seemingly they achieved the end of the annexation threat over them. But actually, they understand today that the old formula that they had in the past that said we will not have any normalization, the Arab world will not have any normalization with Israel unless first there will be a settlement between Israel and the Palestinians, it's over. Really? And that's why the turmoil in the Palestinian arena is so deep.
So how many other Arab states in the region are, because we've heard reports that Oman and Bahrain and other countries are thinking of joining. What is the likelihood of that happening in the near future?
I believe that during this year, we will see the same announcements as they were between Israel and the UAE, between Israel and Bahrain, maybe between Israel and Oman, maybe between Israel and Morocco and northern Sudan. But at least during this year, I think we will not see any dramatic step toward Saudi Arabia, toward North Africa. It will be much more difficult.
All right, now final question quickly. I want to bring this back to Israel with Gaza, because right now you mentioned that the Palestinians are feeling left behind. How might that affect the conflict with Gaza right now?
actually it caused the people in Gaza, especially Hamas, to feel in much more deeper crisis. And I believe that we are on the path of much more dramatic escalation with Hamas. This is only the beginning of what we had during the last week, unfortunately.
Colonel Milstein, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, moving on. To get the UAE-Israel deal done, Israel had to give up on the idea of annexations, at least for the time being. This flying in the face of many of the Prime Minister's now former allies. Political strategist and director of English operations from the Yamina Party, Jeremy Salton, joins us with more. Jeremy, thanks so much for being on the line with us. Now, President Trump made it clear that Israel had promised not to carry out the annexation, while Netanyahu made it clear that this was a temporary postponement. Which one do you believe?
Congratulations on the diplomatic achievement, but it's pretty clear here that this is not a political victory for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't even think this will get him 2 votes. This has killed the sovereignty. I mean, it's just pretty clear. If you're suspending it when we know there's an election in November and the resumption of the sovereignty talks would only be after the possible re-election of Donald Trump, by the time you would start talking about this, we don't know if Israel is going to be going to an election within the next year with the current crisis between Netanyahu and Gantz. It's just very clear that this is putting an end. By suspending it, it's a nice political word to pretty much say that it's over.
I see. All right. Well, after the annexation plan that did not take place on July 1st, as you know, it was postponed to an unknown date. The issue fell off the agenda in Israel. Why did the settlers and the right-wing parties who were in support of annexations still think that it had a chance?
Well, I think at least I've been pretty consistent by saying that the minute that I saw that Netanyahu chose Benny Gantz as his senior coalition partner and to become the next defense minister replacing Naftali Bennett of my party, that this was just not something that was in his top priority. I mean, when Netanyahu formed this government, he said that he was forming it to do 2 things. One was to combat coronavirus, and the second was to apply Israeli sovereignty. And we didn't believe him, and I believe for good reason, because if we're fast forwarding a number of months, it looks more like what he did was combat sovereignty and apply coronavirus through this second wave.
All right. Well, I mean, again, annexation was a central theme of the election promises of Prime Minister Netanyahu, as you just said, and of the Likud party. So will Yamina and other former allies, because you mentioned that this was a political blow ultimately to Netanyahu, in your opinion, will Yamina and other former allies work with Netanyahu and the Likud anytime soon?
I don't think that the right is in Netanyahu's pocket anymore. I think that time has passed. It's long gone. The situation we're dealing with today is that Netanyahu decided that it was more important for him to make a diplomatic deal with a country that's not killed one Israeli, that is all the way on the other side of the Gulf, on the other side of the Middle East, as opposed to going ahead and asserting Israeli sovereignty in Judea and Samaria to the Israeli settlers who are living close to 1 million of them. And this is a decision that we would have seen from a lot of left-wing prime ministers. So I think, yeah, for sure, the right is going to reassess. We're going to have a reassessment of the relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, and we'll have to question if he can even be the prime minister candidate of the right-wing camp in the next election, whenever that is.
All right. Well, do you think that this normalization agreement might actually sway people away from annexations? What are the benefits of making this diplomatic deal? Might people who were pro-annexation maybe see the positives of this deal and maybe back away from annexations, or is that just not a chance?
I think really most Israelis have seen what deals on pieces of paper have brought us, as opposed to what the reality on the ground has shown us. You live in the Middle East a long time, you understand that there's nothing more permanent than temporary, and you understand that when you have an opportunity, it's time to seize it. Netanyahu had a once-in-a-century opportunity to go ahead and apply sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, similar to what we saw with Levi Eshkol, with Eastern Jerusalem, with Menachem Begin, with the Golan Heights. And it looks like the Netanyahu chapter of history will be closed with a peace deal, perhaps, but not with applying even 1 centimeter, not 1 inch of Israeli land.
All right, Jeremy Salton, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, well, not everyone is supporting the peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. The Palestinians, for one, immediately rejecting the deal, calling it a conspiracy and adding that they were blindsided.
تعلن القيادة الفلسطينية رفضها واستنكارها الشديدين للإعلان الثلاثي الأمريكي الإسرائيلي الإماراتي المفاجئ حول تطبيع كامل للعلاقات بين دولة الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ودولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة مقابل ادعاء تعليق مؤقت لمخطط ضم الأراضي الفلسطينية وبسط السيادة الإسرائيلية.
In neighboring Jordan, which has had a peace agreement with Israel since 1994, the deal was seen as overlooking the Palestinians as well.
This is a deal that has been made totally in the absence of Palestinians and did not even involve a reversal of annexation policy. The Israeli Prime Minister was very clear yesterday that he is still for annexation, that he is still going to go ahead with the annexation.
Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan also reacting with threats to the UAE.
Filistin'e yönelik atılan adım yenilir yutulur bir adım değil. Şimdi Filistin Büyükelçiliğini galiba kapatıyor veya geri çekiyor ve şu anda aynı durum bizim için de geçerli. Ben de Dışişleri Bakanıma talimatı verdim. Dedim ki Abu Dhabi yönetimiyle özellikle diplomatik ilişkileri askıya almak veyahut da bizim de büyükelçiyi geri çekme gibi bir adımımız olabilir. Çünkü biz Filistin halkının yanındayız.
Meanwhile, in Lebanon, some leaders have now hinted at potentially following the UAE's lead in the future, just unlikely while Hezbollah is still around. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah calling the move a political favor for Netanyahu.
أيضا خدمة شخصية وانتخابية لنتنياهو. نتنياهو اليوم في الكيان الإسرائيلي في أضعف حالاته منذ بدء حياته السياسية.
And finally, in Iran, a warning to the Middle East that this may be a step in the wrong direction.
دچار یک مسیر اشتباه و غلطی شدند. اونا فکر میکنن خودشونه بچسبونن با آمریکا یا بچسبونن به رژیم صهیونیستی، امنیت اونها تأمین میشه، اقتصاد اونها رشد پیدا میکنه. این کاملا اشتباهه.
So as we've seen, many in the Arab world's leadership are blasting the new normalization deal between Israel and the UAE. But how about what people are saying on the street? With the answers is Noam Bennett, a political cartoon analyst who focuses his research on the Arab world. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm really excited about this topic. All right, so what are the general themes, in the cartoons coming out since the deal was announced?
Of course, it depends where are they from. Characters from the Palestinians, they talk a lot about how the Arab world forgot them, how they deserted them. We see it all over, and they talk about it a lot. Like they're waiting for the Arab world to save them from themselves. We see also characters that are mocking rivals. For example, one of the characters we see Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president. His words are saying, no, I'm against normalization with Israel, right? That's what he's saying. He's the Sultan. He's the one in charge. He's the one talking for the Palestinians. But we see him with the David Star. We see him holding popcorn like he's in a party. Behind him, we see a Qatari dancer. Looks like a belly dancer, but with a Israeli flag. So it wants to show us how hypocrites are Turkey and Qatar when they say on the one hand that they're against the normalization with the Emirates, Israeli Emirates, and the other hand, how that there's an Israeli ambassador in Turkey. They have relationships, so they want to show how hypocrite they are.
Well, so what about the positive relations? Because you said this kind of depends on where you are. Yes. What about the countries that are maybe pro?
Most of the countries that are pro won't say it. For example, the character that we saw came from Saudi Arabia.
Of Erdogan?
The character with Erdogan came from Saudi Arabia. And we know that there's a rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Turkey. I mean, there's two blocks in the Sunni world, in the Sunni Muslim world. On the one hand, we have Turkey, Qatar, and their ideas come from the Muslim Brotherhood, the mother organization of Hamas, on the one hand. On the other hand, we have Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt. So we see many caricatures, one side mocking the other side. One of the things that is breaking here in the whole story of the normalization with the Emirates with Israel, is that after Egypt and after Jordan and after Oslo, of course, of the PLO, the Arabs knew that if you want to go to a normalization or Israeli or peace process with Israel, it's after you finish the story with the Palestinians. And the Emirates are the first one who say, you know what? Nothing is going on there for many years. Let's put it on the table. And that's what they're doing.
All right, Noam, thank you so much for being with us today and taking us through some of these cartoons.
Of course, sure.
All right, coming back to Israel now, the anti-Netanyahu protests are not letting up. Completely dismissing the normalization with the UAE as a distraction, at least 10 were arrested overnight as hundreds of Israelis demonstrated outside the Prime Minister's home in Jerusalem, as well as thousands around the country, although the turnout was slightly less than in recent weeks. Demonstrators held signs with slogans like "Prime Minister," demanding Netanyahu resign over corruption charges and his handling of COVID-19. Netanyahu has accused protesters of being hooligans and criminals. Well, as protesters demonstrate against Israel's response to COVID-19, the numbers continue to rise. But there is a silver lining. As of today, Israelis can officially fly to several spots abroad without having to quarantine. Nittany Manson reports.
Despite COVID-19 cases continuing to rise in Israel, the skies are set to reopen and gathering restrictions eased. As of today, Israelis can officially travel to Croatia, Bulgaria, and some parts of Greece without having to quarantine. Also, if Israelis are traveling to what are considered green countries, they will not have to isolate upon return. Public gatherings will also be allowed to expand slightly. Up to 30 people will now be permitted in open spaces. For indoors, depending on the size of the area, new rules will allow groups of 10 to 20 people. On Saturday, the Health Ministry reported 761 new cases. Total number of infections in the country reaching a total of over 92,000. There are 23,300 active cases, and 4 people succumbing to the disease on Saturday brings the new total to 679. Nittany Manson, ILTV.
Now, international cooperation still running in spite of the coronavirus. Plans just being altered slightly. The Israeli Air Force heading out to Germany on Monday to take part in the first ever joint Israeli-German Air Force exercise abroad.
התרגיל המשותף עם חיל האוויר הגרמני נתרגל מספר מתארים ומספר משימות שמעניינים את שני הצדדים. התרגיל הזה נותן הרבה מאוד ללוחמי צוות האוויר במטוסים. טיסה באזור לא מוכר, טיסה בשפה לא מוכרת, טיסה על פי תורת לחימה שונה. יש לנו הרבה מאוד מה ללמוד ולהתאמן, ובעצם תרגיל כזה משפר מאוד את היכולת המבצעית של כל טייס.
Now, the 2-week exercise, which includes a memorial flyby over the Dachau concentration camp, aims at enhancing Air Force capabilities in unfamiliar terrain. And NATO forces will be taking part in the drills as well. Israel's Air Force in particular will be operating in 6 F-16 Barak fighter jets, 2 Boeing 707 REM transport jets, and 2 Gulfstream G550 Eitan control jets. And now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight should be clear and warm with lows averaging 71 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 degrees Celsius. Then tomorrow you can expect another sunny and clear day, but with a slight drop in temperatures to highs around 88 or 31 degrees Celsius. And now before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel.
Is it time for dinner?
So this is apparently how cats ask for food nowadays. That's a genius new way of ordering from the menu. I think I'm going to adopt this next time I go out somewhere, even at home with my piano. I'm just going to start banging on keys to demand food. It's genius. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.41 shekels to the American dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV pages. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.